welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Cho. The U.S. and South Korea conducted joint military exercises, and North Korea, in response, carried out a series of weapons demonstrations. Kim Jong-un oversaw nuclear attack simulations involving a purported underwater attack drone and missiles. Today, we discuss how South Korea can best respond to North Korea's growing nuclear and missile threat.
And is the latest in a series of launches that pose a threat to the DPRK's neighbors and undermine regional security.
There's no indications or no information at this time that would lead us to believe that some sort of actual strike by North Korea is imminent, but we're watching and monitoring as best we can.
In the studio with me, Mr. Thomas Countryman, Chair of the Board of Directors of the Arms Control Association. Mr. Countryman served as Acting Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security until 2017. He returned to the State Department as a Senior Advisor for International Security and Non-Proliferation until September of last year. Also joining us, Mr. Eric Brewer, Deputy Vice President for Nuclear Threat Initiative's Nuclear Materials Security Program. Mr. Brewer served as the Director for Counterproliferation at the National Security Council from 2017 to 2018. While at the NSC, he played a lead role in implementing elements of U.S.-North Korea policy. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Now, Mr. Brewer, North Korea said it has tested an underwater drone that can carry nuclear warheads that can cause radioactive tsunami. Russia has also developed Poseidon torpedo. How advanced is this technology, and how much of a threat is this, and how can South Korea defend itself against this new drone?
It's certainly a concerning development. Unfortunately, it comes in a long list of concerning developments that are taking place on the peninsula and different types of delivery systems that North Korea is developing. I think it serves a couple of different goals for North Korea. And I should say at the outset, we're just learning of this, although apparently it's been in development for some time. It's really hard to say exactly how far along they are in that development process, so there's a lot of unknowns that surround it. But I think it serves a couple of different purposes for North Korea. One, it furthers Kim Jong-un's goal of demonstrating and trying to prove that North Korea is an established nuclear weapons state and it's not going anywhere. As you noted, Russia has developed an unmanned nuclear torpedo. Theirs uses nuclear propulsion. There's no signs that North Korea's system does, so there's a qualitative technological difference there, of course. But I think, we're talking about this, so it does send that signal, or at least that's Kim Jong-un's goal. And the second goal I think that it serves is developing systems that can get around missile defense, right? He knows that the United States and South Korea are working on improving their capabilities. So in order to have nuclear weapons that can reach the peninsula, he needs a way to get around them.
Now, Mr. Countryman, North Korea also claims to have detonated mock nuclear warhead at 600 meter above water, 800 meter above water. Does North Korea have that technology of a precision of timing and altitude of detonating such a mock warhead?
Well, first, the reason for detonating at altitude is that it maximizes the impact of the explosion and the range of the destructive impact. Detonating at ground level maximizes radioactive fallout. The technology for detonating an explosive at altitude is old. The United States was doing it 90 years ago. Whether North Korea has that technology to control precisely the altitude and specifically to initiate a nuclear detonation is unknown.
Now, if North Korea uses the nuclear drone that it has just tested, the underwater drone, then that would stop U.S. forces from coming in and helping the South Korean forces in times of contingency, wouldn't it?
I don't think that they can stop the U.S. from reinforcing the South Korean allies in any contingency. Is it a complication? Of course. Is it a barrier? No.
So, Mr. Brewer, North Korea developing all these new weapons, we just talked about how it complicates its defense. So wouldn't it weaken U.S. extended deterrence provided to South Korea?
Well, one of the things that we're seeing right now, in addition to these testings of singular systems, right, and new delivery systems, new technologies, is we're also seeing North Korea try and fire multiple systems at once and sort of rehearse and practice in a way in which it might actually do so during a conflict or a war on the peninsula. And so that's another thing that's concerning, of course, because it raises the risk of nuclear use, right? One of Kim Jong-un's sort of the way in which he has to operate his nuclear force is he has to get these nuclear weapons off the ground before the United States and North Korea can take them out beforehand. These certainly pose challenges to extended deterrence, right? These are things that can't be ignored. But one of the things that's happening right now is the U.S. and South Korea are actually they're engaged in exercises, they're engaged in high-level dialogues where they're discussing the evolving North Korean nuclear threat, where they're talking about how this might bear on the requirements of extended deterrence. So I personally am confident that they will be able to adapt to these challenges.
I think one of the things that confuses and complicates the situation is that many people equate extended deterrence with nuclear deterrence. Extended deterrence means a full range of tools relying first and primarily on conventional superiority to deter North Korea. And so we need to focus on what the ROK in the United States, together with an ally like Japan, can do to strengthen conventional readiness and capability.
Now, Mr. Brewer, the UN Security Council has again failed to do any action on North Korea's ICBM testing. But back in 2017, Russia and China agreed to 4 different sanctions resolutions on North Korea. And at the time, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, said that she used President Trump's unpredictability and talked about the use of force and military actions to Russia and China. Is there any way that we can revive such sanctions momentum in the UN Security Council?
Well, first of all, I would say I don't think it's a smart idea to try and coerce China or Russia into applying sanctions on North Korea by threatening military force and by threatening a war. I think that's irresponsible and quite dangerous. But we're a long way from 2017 in a lot of respects, right? And so there's been a number of developments that I think would make it very hard to rewind the clock to that environment. We now have the experience of the 2 U.S.-North Korea summits, which ended badly. And I think Kim Jong-un came away from especially the summit in Hanoi feeling burned. So he's brought that experience with him that I think makes him more reluctant to engage. So for a whole host of reasons, I'm not sure you could really wind the clock back to that environment that allowed for those UN Security Council resolutions, because clearly I think in that environment, Russia and China don't really see it as in their interests to vote in favor of something that's going to give the United States a foreign policy win.
Now, Mr. Countryman, North Korea's foreign ministry said that if the U.S. demands North Korea to completely denuclearize, they would consider it as a declaration of war. Do you still think that denuclearization of North Korea is still feasible?
First, I'm never surprised by anything that the North Korean foreign ministry says. They've made that statement on more than one occasion. It should remain the ultimate goal of the United States and its allies in Asia to achieve the complete denuclearization of the peninsula. Is it feasible tomorrow? No. There's a number of steps that have to be taken beforehand, including convincing North Korea that it is in its own interest to talk to the United States.
So if North Korea decides to come back to the table, how feasible would that be? Do we have verification problems?
Of course we would have verification problems. That's why you need very detailed discussions. There is no such thing as what Mr. Trump conceived of, which is one big meeting is going to solve all problems. It will be a complicated process. I salute Mr. Trump for having at least tried to initiate a process, even though he carried it out in a very poor manner.
So
I would just add to what Tom said. I mean, I think one of the first elements of the conversation, if we're fortunate enough to find ourselves back in dialogue with North Korea, is to focus on, rather than going all the way into denuclearization right off the bat, is to take some practical steps on risk reduction and perhaps arms control. Small measures that may reduce the threat posed by North Korea's nuclear arsenal and reduce the chances of nuclear war on the peninsula. And then build on that as you work towards denuclearization.
So if you have that interim deal of denuclearization, what are you going to do about North Korea's dishonesty? North Korea not declaring all its weapons facilities. Director General of IAEA said many times that North Korea's nuclear programs are spawning geographically. It's not only about Yongbyon anymore. How are we going to do about that?
Well, that's the verification challenge, and that's the challenge of verifying what North Korea says and the types of declarations that it submits, and that's a serious problem. But I think there are smaller steps you can take that don't require tackling that comprehensive problem at the outset, that are nevertheless beneficial for the United States, for South Korea, and for others in the region.
And that interim process of arms reduction, wouldn't that just buy time for North Korea to retain its nuclear weapons?
Well, they're certainly retaining them now and advancing them now, right? And so I think you can perhaps reach some agreement with North Korea that prevents the development of even more dangerous capabilities, of other types of threatening capabilities that at least prevent the threat from getting worse, right? It may not reduce the number of nuclear weapons they have at the outset. That's a problem you would have to tackle later on. But it at least puts some degree of a cap on the problem in ways that can be beneficial.
So during that process, wouldn't South Korea, which is facing existential threat from North Korea, think that Washington is tacitly accepting North Korea as a nuclear weapon state while this process is going on?
I don't think there is anything that would require the United States to accept North Korea's nuclear status as part of that process.
U.S. would not, of course, formally accept North Korea as a nuclear weapon state, but the environment and the situation that would be perceived as South Korea thinking that North Korea is being accepted as a nuclear weapon state.
I mean, I think the United States could be quite clear, along with its allies, right, that they don't accept North Korea's nuclear status, that the ultimate goal is denuclearization, but that does not prevent progress in other areas.
Today, the reality is North Korea possesses nuclear weapons. It is a fact. You can either say, we don't accept that fact, and so we will never talk to the North Koreans until they give it up. And under that path, they will continue to build more and different kinds of nuclear weapons. Or you could say, here's a fact that has to be dealt with. And if a process begins, we have the potential to get to the end goal that we require, which is no nuclear weapons on the peninsula.
And you're both non-proliferation experts, and you've been in the government for a very high level. But U.S. government officials openly raised concerns about North Korea and Iran's missile cooperation, but not about nuclear cooperation. Why is this? Is it because U.S. does not have evidence going beyond circumstantial ones, or is it because U.S. does not want to reveal its intelligence?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly the case that, at least I'm not aware of any instance where the United States or the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is the organization charged with monitoring nuclear programs worldwide, or really actually any credible source, has made the accusation that Iran and North Korea are cooperating. But so I think we've got to take that for what it is, right? Of course, is there cooperation on missiles? Yes, that's a different story, right? Those claims have been made. But I think that's certainly a powerful data point.
And another powerful data point is 2011, a German media Süddeutsche Zeitung reported, citing intelligence sources, that North Korea has transferred nuclear technology to Iran. They were very specific that the transfer included software that could be used for development of nuclear reactors or weapons and data from North Korea's nuclear experiments. Isn't this clear evidence enough?
Well, I'm not specifically familiar with that report, but I mean, I think the fact that you had to go back to 2011 to find a data point in a German newspaper is a bit telling. No U.S. government, no IAEA official, nobody that would really know has made that accusation.
And then there were other media reports about Iranian scientists observing North Korea's nuclear weapons experiments. Has the U.S. government been able to verify that at all?
Again, claims occasionally crop up. I can't possibly comment on any sort of intelligence matters or anything like that. But all we know is that U.S. government, the IAEA, nobody has made that accusation in public.
Now, you're, again, both non-proliferation experts. Do you see South Korea's growing calls for nuclear armament, Mr. Countryman, as a potential non-proliferation concern?
First, I'm not sure they're growing. I heard what the president said in January, and I responded with my own point of view. I think that the president has walked that back in more recent statements, so I'm not sure that we can call it growing calls. But I remain convinced that this would be an unwise path for the ROK to pursue. Look, there are many things I would love to have if I paid no attention to the costs and the consequences of possessing them. And that's exactly the case for the ROK. To ask people, would you like to have a nuclear weapon? A lot of them are going to say yes. If you ask them, would you like to have a nuclear weapon? If it means that your neighbors, Japan, Indonesia, Australia, also decide to build nuclear weapons, would you like to have nuclear weapons if it costs you in terms of international prestige, in terms of your economic standing, and in terms of your relationship with the United States? That's a very different question. And until there is a more forthright discussion about the costs and the consequences of pursuing nuclear weapons, then I think that the public opinion is not based on a factual reading of the situation.
So I think those discussions are a reason for concern, but they're not reason for panic, right? I think anytime the leadership of a country or a group of nuclear weapons advocates is publicly calling for nuclear weapons, I think that should grab our attention, and it is concerning, especially in the case of South Korea, because South Korea has long been such a strong supporter of the nuclear nonproliferation regime. And it's also an instance where South Korea falls under the U.S. nuclear umbrella, right, and is protected by extended deterrence. And so I think that again, is concerning, but not worth panicking over. And much like Tom said, this discourse is notable for the absence of the considerations of the risks of going down that pathway, which would be substantial for South Korea. And it could impact everything from trade to South Korea's civil nuclear program to the alliance with the United States. And so there's significant risk that that decision would entail.
So when it comes to that trade, Mr. Countryman, South Korea exported a lot of arms to NATO member nations after the Ukraine war. South Korea is a leading country that develops semiconductors and energy batteries. So other countries may also have to do a very difficult cost-benefit calculations if they're going to sever trade relations with South Korea, wouldn't they?
I'm sure that they would have to make that calculation. I don't know why Seoul would want to invite other countries to make that calculation.
There's several different risks that South Korea would entail in embarking on a nuclear weapons program or producing nuclear weapons. Several of those fall into categories of things that the United States has no say over, right, or can't possibly control. There's some discussion within the pro-nuclear weapons groups that somehow the United States can be convinced to accept South Korea's proliferation or that it would go along with it. I'm skeptical of that argument. I think that's a big risk. It's a big assumption. But even if you could persuade a particular president or an administration, there are sanctions that would kick in that are automatic, that don't have a presidential waiver. That's the Glenn Amendment. And as part of that, that would affect things like the U.S. ability to sell military equipment to South Korea. That would be cut off. It would affect the export of certain types of technology to South Korea. That would be cut off. And so these are things that are mandatory, that would be required. And that doesn't even touch on other types of penalties, again, that the United States doesn't have any influence over for the most part, such as nuclear suppliers group restrictions. Countries would have to stop providing South Korea with the uranium that's used in South Korean nuclear reactors. That would be devastating to South Korea's domestic nuclear energy program, let alone its plans to be a leader in the nuclear reactor export market. So to Tom's point, it's not clear why they would undertake such risks.
So Mr. Brewer just talked about those automatic kick-in of those sanctions, the Glenn Amendment, but Mr. Countryman, under AUKUS, the AUKUS group provides Australia with nuclear propulsion submarine, and also there is prospect that they can even transfer enriched uranium to Australia under this pact. So isn't this another sign that under certain circumstances, U.S. considers strategic value that goes beyond non-proliferation concerns, and that could also be applied to South Korea?
Well, certainly we have seen that the government of the United States is capable of balancing strategic interests against principles. I don't think that's the case with Australia and the AUKUS submarine program. There are no nuclear weapons going to be transferred. There will be enriched uranium inside a reactor, inside a submarine, under control of the International Atomic Energy Agency. None of that applies to the hypothetical situation you're talking about when South Korea would explicitly develop nuclear weapons. So yes, theoretically, any decision is possible. But one of the questions that, again, I think is not asked in South Korea is which do you value more? Independent nuclear deterrent with all of its costs, or a continuation of the kind of alliance and protection that the U.S. offers today, because you cannot have both.
And Mr. Countryman, that's also a very hard question for United States as well, because South Korea is a key ally in Northeast Asia. There is the biggest U.S. Army base in South Korea, which is Camp Humphreys. In Northeast Asia, China, North Korea, Russia, they all have nuclear weapons. And under the strategic landscape, it wouldn't be an easy choice, especially given the U.S.-China strategic competition.
There are no easy choices in Northeast Asia. I'm very much aware of that. However, if the Republic of Korea chooses to change the very basis of the alliance, the structure it has had, it would be naive to assume that there are no consequences for the alliance.
Can I add on top of that too? I mean, look, we've run this game before where some would argue that nuclear armed allies would somehow be in the United States' interest, right? During the 1950s and the 1960s, we had the same debate within the United States, particularly over the potential value of West Germany having nuclear weapons in the context of the Cold War and deterring the Soviet Union. And we weighed the risks and benefits of nuclear proliferation, and that was resolved firmly in the position of nuclear proliferation, even to allies, was not in the U.S. interests. And so the notion that somehow more countries in the Indo-Pacific with nuclear weapons is a good thing or is valuable for their security or our security or international security, I think is misguided.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Mr. Brewer, Mr. Countryman, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.